Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 6th, and we will hear the presentation, The Value of the Curb, Organization, Regulation, and Monetization of Your Precious Right-of-Way. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box located in your webinar toolbar, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2020. Thanks to all those participating and making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today's webcast is sponsored by the APA Colorado chapter. So thanks to you for pulling this together and sponsoring today's session. Coming up next on your screen is a screenshot actually of our webcast webpage. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast where you can see a list of all of our upcoming sessions, and this is where you can register for them. So like I said, this is a screenshot. We do have a couple tabs up at the top. The prior webcast tab, that's where we have PDF copies of all of our previous sessions. We do have some distance education sessions available, 2 law and 2 ethics. So those are available for your viewing on demand for credit through the end of 2020. So again, head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. Just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. And from there, you can search either by the title or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. So that's how you can log those AICP CM credits. I'm not sure yet if the CM search function is working again, but it was down for a while. So searching by the event number or title wasn't working. If you still have trouble, you can feel free to email me at info@ohioplanning.org. and I can get you a direct link to log those AICP CM credits. Like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any new sessions that are now available to register for, or if there's a date change, a time change, a cancellation, all that kind of information is where I post on Facebook. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. We record all of our sessions and post them up on our YouTube channel. So be sure to join us so that you get instant notification when we have a new session available for you to view. We have over 300 sessions, over 3,100 subscribers. So be sure to join us. That is the end of my housekeeping. So I am now going to turn it over to Becky Eldridge, who is going to kick things off for us today. Becky.
Thank you. Hello, everyone out there. Thank you for joining us on a Friday after a week of quite a few things going on. We really appreciate it. My name is Becky, and I'm here in Northern Ohio, and I work for Walker Consultants. I work in PR and marketing, and I'll be hosting and doing the Q&A afterwards, and our content matter experts will be joining us. So the topic again today is all about the value of the curb, how you can protect, monetize, regulate that precious right-of-way. So we'll be discussing lots of stuff around that. Our 2 experts are on the screen with me. It's Chrissy Mancini-Nichols and then Mallory Baker. There they are. Chrissy is in San Fran and Mallory is out in Colorado. Chrissy's primary role in Walker is she's a parking and mobility consultant, and she's our lead on curb management. So we're really excited to have her here as part of this because this is definitely an area she's passionate about and very expert on. And Mallory similarly brings very strong credentials in the mobility space. She's really wonderful at the public engagement and leading our practice in that. And both of them have lots of experience across multiple municipalities. And we're really excited to have them here. Here is what our agenda looks like. We're going to spend a little time getting to know each other. We'll be doing that via Menti. We're going to discuss and define curb management. We're going to provide a framework where you can look at where you are on the curb management spectrum. We're going to discuss some treatments for success. We'll talk about implementing it to make it also practical, not just theoretical, around data, policy, technology, and fees, and then we'll have a group activity. Throughout the session, at any point, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat function, and we'll have breaks along the way between each section to address any questions or, to bring up any anecdotes or stories of your own. That would be really great. So now I invite you all to go on to www.menti.com, and you can use it code 635376. Our first question for you all is, what industry are you in? So go ahead and click, are you government, university, hospital, airport, consultant like me, or other? We're seeing a lot of government folks. This is my first time using Menti. I have to say I'm kind of behind the curve, but it's really fun to see those bars going up and down. This is very cool. Great, we're seeing a lot of government, a lot of consultant. We're gonna wait just a couple more seconds to see, make sure we're getting a fair majority. If you have any technical questions, throw them in the chat. We're happy to answer. And for those of you who have maybe like me never used Menti, all you have to do is open a new browser, type in Menti, it'll ask you for this code, and then you can participate in our survey. It's really simple. There's no tying in your email address or anything like that. Great, I'm seeing those responses slow down a little bit. So I think we can see that we're primarily talking to folks who come from a government background, or their industry is in the government, consultancy, other, or university. Got about 111 responses. Great. Our next question is, how often do you use the following transportation modes? Drive alone, carpool, walk, bike, Uber, Lyft, public transit. And we fully recognize that right now is a bit of a strange time. So just answer right now, not what is typical. I see some bikers out there like me when I can. A lot of drive alones, some carpoolers. We got some walkers in there, some TNC users, and public transit.
And Becky, I don't know if you know this, but the little wave shows the distribution of responses. So we can see that a lot of people are responding always to drive alone, and the like walking has more of a distribution, and same with biking. I just think that's a really cool feature of Mentimeter.
Thank you, Mallory. I agree.
Anytime.
Great. Thank you for weighing in. Just a couple more questions. In my community, we have not yet considered curb management. We're just starting to think about it. We're most focused on enforcing rules and regulations in the right-of-way. We are most focused on prioritizing certain modes of travel in the right-of-way, or we are focused on ways to monetize our curb space.
This is a great mix of attendees, sort of all over the curb management journey.
Yeah, I love that.
Absolutely. Great. So yeah, a real mix, you know, about 30% with the priorities on certain modes of travel and the right of way. Oh, here comes a couple more. Not yet considering, so early on the journey. So really pretty evenly split. I am most excited to learn about basic methods to make the right-of-way in my community a public usable space, ways to create rules for the curb and enforce them. It's so fun. Ways to prioritize certain modes of transportation and or discourage others. Ways to recoup costs from operations and maintenance of the curb in the right-of-way or other. And maybe you're interested in more than one, which is fine, but you know, go ahead and choose one. Seeing a lot of responses come in for those basic methods. People are excited to learn about ways to prioritize certain modes of transportation and or discourage others. Some interest in recouping the costs, and then interest across all 5 things we asked about. Great. When I think of curb management, I think of...
I think this is the last question. So that was for the activity.
Okay, great. Thank you everybody for that participation. We just wanted to sort of understand where everyone's at, what they're most excited about, so that we're making sure that we're addressing all of that. So having said all of that, my part of the job for the moment is done, and I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy Mancini-Nichols.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I know it's been a long week for a lot of us, not with the election, and there are a lot of transportation ballot measures on the election that have kept us up at night. So we are, thank you for being here. I'm Chrissy Mancini-Nichols. As Becky said, I lead Walker's curb management strategy. I'm based in San Francisco, but have lived and worked in many cities across the country. My background's in transportation and mobility planning and transportation funding. So I want to talk to you today about the curb management journey and learn some lessons on implementation of curb management.
Chrissy, I think you have muted yourself.
Oh, sorry about
that. There you go. That's fine.
So a little
You're back.
About Walker. We are all things parking and mobility. We have offices across the country, and we work with municipalities, transit agencies, developers, universities, hospitals, all the spectrum of entities. So today our learning objectives are really to think about the curb management spectrum and talk about your curb management journey, how to get started, and then steps to implementation. So first, let's talk about why curb management. So since the first on-street parking regulations were enacted over a century ago, cities have had some form of curb management. It's just been focused on parking private vehicles. So what we're talking about today is really the next evolution of curb management to accommodate all these new trends you see on the screen. Ride apps, scooters, ways that people are changing how they want to get around beyond driving and parking. Growth in e-commerce has meant the need for more delivery space. So without prioritization of your curb, you're left with double parking, congestion, safety issues, and you're left unprepared for whatever is invented next year. A few years ago, scooters were just something kids rode around their neighborhoods on, and now people whiz around them to, commute. So we want to be prepared for whatever is next. So with all those demands, it's really a simple concept in theory. Curbs are a finite space. We want to prioritize access. We want to get people turning over in those spaces. We want to bring more people to community, and we want to manage demand. So these trends have been ongoing. We all know them. And now we're dealing with COVID-19, and we're seeing that our curbs can really be used to help businesses for short-term loading, for delivery, for parklets, for outdoor dining. And it's really been amazing to see just the action cities have taken to deal with COVID-19. You know, we can all say some of the recommendations that usually take years to implement, our cities are calling us and saying, or even transit agencies, we need to implement these things today. So it's really amazing to see how cities are being super nimble right now. And another benefit is people have seen that removing parking spaces for parklets or slow streets, it's not this scary thing. We can see it, and people can see that this is something we like and is great for our community. So those learnings can really help us implement these curb management strategies for the long term. So also just using curbs to deal with COVID-19 has reinforced what many of us already know. And if it's one thing I think we want to leave you with today, it's that the curb is some of the most valuable real estate in a city. It's probably one of your most extensive assets. For example, I worked at a regional planning organization in Chicago for a very long time, and we always said curbs in the right-of-way made up 30% of all the city held and managed land in Chicago. You know, that's a lot of value, and that really gives you leverage to manage not just, you know, all the needs of your community for access to a location, but, you know, private operators that really want access to that curb. And another point, as we're talking about that value and demands of the curb, it's really important to understand that curb management is a journey. That journey is based on your local context and needs. Cities are at different stages in their journey. You know, we saw that today just from the polling at the beginning. Some of you are just starting out, others are thinking about access fees. So you may just be dealing with on-street parking time limits. You may be considering a shared bike lane or pickup or drop-off zone. And then we see, you know, other cities like San Francisco or DC or New York, you know, they're further along in their journey because they have different demands. They're looking at reserved commercial loading zones, right up pickup and drop off. You know, and that's great. I think we can learn some best practices and see what works in some of these cities that are implementing these strategies, and then apply them to our local context and what is right for our community priorities. So today we're going to talk about the curb management journey and the planning process for that local context. And, you know, basically, how do we use curb management? What is a simple way to prioritize and organize this space based on your local priorities? Because then we can really use curbs to provide more access. We can use curbs to create a safer environment, and we can use curbs to generate revenue. It's a precious piece of real estate. So first, I want to ask Becky, are there any questions before we move on? Oh, Becky, you're muted.
This is a great time and a little break that we've built in. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'd love to hear them. And then while we're waiting for that, Chrissy, I actually have a really quick question for you. Okay, so I always think of the curb as that piece that is, you know, raised above. But when you're talking about it, you're talking about the whole right of way. Is that true, or am I?
Yeah, I think we want to consider our right of way. Our curb is a piece of that right of way. You know, the right of way can serve transit lanes, bike lanes, travel lanes, parking lanes, and all of those at some point are going to interact with the curb. So really it's thinking about all that right of way space we have in between those two curbs on each side of the street.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We don't have any questions yet, but again, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you and make this a little more interactive. It's a Friday. It's towards the end of the week. So, you know, feel free to ask any questions along the way.
Okay, and so with that, let's hand it off to Mallory to talk about the curb management framework.
Thanks, Chrissy. Hi, I'm Mallory Baker. As Becky mentioned in the beginning, I lead our public engagement strategy firm-wide, and I also focus primarily on our municipal practice. I'm really passionate about ensuring that curb management is a collaborative process with meaningful participation from the community, and also that there's a clear link between management of the curb and the broader goals that a community has set forth. So it's clear, as we've talked about, that the curb is a really valuable asset that should be managed, but achieving that goal can be a daunting process. So we wanted to walk through some clear steps to a comprehensive curb management framework that works for your unique community. The first step is really creating goals, and you might already be well on your way to doing that. If you could go back to the previous slide, sorry. You really want to start first with your master plan, transportation master plan, comprehensive plan, maybe even climate and sustainability initiatives or economic goals, to start to think about priorities for the curb and develop that clear prioritization in terms of who needs access to the curb and when. And that might be different for different, core land use contexts in your community. It's also really a really great primer for getting to the education and outreach process, because you're starting to prime the relationship and draw the clear relationship between the broader goals you've made in terms of planning for your community and what happens on the ground with your curb and your right-of-way. So where does it make the most sense to apply curb management? The answer is not everywhere. Some areas like big box stores or single family residential neighborhoods don't necessarily make sense for active curb management, but areas where multiple modes converge, where that competition for access is clear and apparent, are prime for application. So once you select those focus areas, it's really important to gather existing data, using physical observations, looking at the conditions of the right-of-way, where the sidewalk is, where curb cuts are, where signage is, getting qualitative feedback from the community, and also just seeing kind of on an ad hoc basis how people are using the curb. So you can see how people are sort of creating their own curb management within the right-of-way as they move in those activity centers.
So Mallory, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How should cities, communities consider or even evaluate existing conditions during COVID-19 if they're trying to develop long-range solutions and treatments?
That's a really great question. I think it's so dependent on the community, but one way that we've been seen as helpful, especially in communities where you're trying to do long-range treatments. So you're trying to create curb management strategies for well into the future, where hopefully we don't have an active pandemic going on all the time. The best way is to use your existing data, your pre-pandemic data that you might have gathered, inventory, parking occupancy, any other turnover data, any other data that you as a community through your enforcement programs or through your other parking management or right-of-way management programs have gathered over the years. But if you're trying to do more temporary treatments pertaining to COVID, it is important to get out there and collect data that's current, so you can see how people are starting to use the right-of-way with new public health regulations and what have you. And we have seen that some areas haven't been as impacted by COVID as other areas. For example, if you have a long-standing residential neighborhood that abuts a central business district, we've seen that the data in those areas has been pretty sustained through pre-COVID and current conditions. So this is where you really use your prioritization framework and your data analysis to determine core functions of the curb. And using these components, you can start to clearly demarcate appropriate locations and sizing and physical treatments for various points of the curb. So as an example, let's say you're attempting to reduce vehicle storage in your core downtown and have found that, let's say your off-street garages, when you did your data analysis, have excess capacity. You can use the stick of expanding pedestrian amenities in the right-of-way, like parklets and expanded sidewalks, alongside the carrot of lowered hourly pricing and clear signage to direct folks to the garages instead of the typical on-street circulation that they would perform if there were more capacity downtown. So with education and outreach, this is my area of vast interest, and I think it's incredibly important. Curb management strategies just aren't implementable without broad-based community buy-in. So firstly, it's really important to convey the value of the curb and be transparent, establish mutual benefit, start to get your community to realize the importance of the curb space, the value that it brings, and the fact that it is a public asset. Especially in residential communities, for example, with neighborhood parking permit programs, you start to create a sense of entitlement to the public right-of-way. And what curb management does is it makes people realize that this is a public asset that needs to be treated as such. And it's incredibly important for cities to establish that with their communities. You really want to be very transparent, as I mentioned, especially if monetization is in play. If you're doing parking pricing, for example, or if you're doing delivery fees, you really want to make it really clear what that money is going to be used for, whether it's benefits to the curb or broader benefits for the community. Pilot programs are a really incredible way of testing efficacy, and it's also a really great teaching tool. As an example, the neighborhood that I used to live in Denver, there was a pilot program for a switching of bike lane and on-street parking. So the on-street parking used to be next to the travelway, and the bike lane used to be next to the travelway, and the on-street parking was abutting the curb. And they switched it first using signage and some temporary bollards. And people, they screwed it up many times over many weeks, and then they got used to it. But they were able to test it out and experience it before it was permanent. So engaging the community, especially during COVID, is incredibly challenging, and especially with this added push for equity in planning, increased equity in planning. So frequently a broad swath of the community is left out of the planning process. And these are things that you're doing that impact the entire community. So we found a lot of benefits, in fact, through virtual engagement, which we were all very tentative and hesitant about initially. We're used to doing the big public open houses, the downtown events. We love being around people, but actually virtual engagement has allowed us to engage people using multiple layers. So allowing people to engage in the ways that they want to, when they want to, whether just learning about the project, filling out a quick poll, or doing more extensive engagement. And also we've been able to reach swaths of the community that we just haven't been able to reach before. So frequently in open houses, you have the same people coming over and over and over again. With virtual engagement, you can really push to broaden and diversify the people that you hear from. And another important factor there is clear identification of underrepresented communities. This is an example of a graphic that we did for the city of Boulder, identifying some clear communities, members of your community that have not been represented in the planning process previously, maybe even establishing a couple community connectors, people within those communities that are trusted members who you can leverage to spread the word, so that when you do implement something on the curb, it's implementable because a broad swath of the community, your entire community, is supporting it. We also just wanted to show this quick example of a digital hub. So this, again, is for a project in Boulder. This was custom built, it's mobile optimized. It's also just layered, so you can learn about the project, you can do a quick poll, you can do a questionnaire, you can join the discussion in other ways. And we've gotten a lot of success from this in terms of making sure that the entire community has a way to engage with this process and this project, so that by the time you get to implementation, you have this large body of community engagement that you can use to support your outcomes. So this is an example from the city of Seattle. Again, this is really emphasizing the importance of the planning work that your city or community has already done. I know a lot of you said you haven't even started the curb management process, but I bet you have. If you have a comprehensive plan, if you have a transportation master plan, if you've done any multimodal work, you have started that process because you've started to prioritize what your community wants to do with this essential piece of real estate. And the city of Seattle, I would urge all of you to look at their prioritization matrix and what they've done with curb management in terms of how they've really characterized and classified prioritization in different land use contexts throughout their city.
Yeah, Mallory, I think that's such an important point, is that often when we work with cities that are just getting started, they don't realize they've already done a lot of the work in their planning and their prioritization, getting community input. So they're already halfway there. Becky, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, there are. Give me 1 sec. Okay, great. What about spillover from mixed-use districts into single-family residential districts? Is there some sort of standard radius around these areas that should be looked at?
Yeah, I think you definitely, when you're collecting data and beginning to figure out planning and beginning to implement planning, you want to look at the blocks around your core commercial areas to see what those land uses are and then adequately plan for that. So for example, we were talking with the city yesterday, and they have a core downtown that's maybe a 10-block radius, but right around there is mostly residential, some mixed use residential. And we were talking about, well, what do we do to prevent spillover? Do we have a neighborhood parking permit program? Do we ramp up enforcement? I think there's some of those techniques that we can use to make sure, people aren't going in and parking on those neighborhood residential streets, and those spaces are open for people that live in the area.
Yeah, and I would quickly add that you want to balance the need to prioritize or preserve character of a neighborhood with this interest or pressure to prioritize the right of way for certain people. I think we see a lot of cities get into this trap where, the residential, the homeowners within a community, especially wealthy communities, have kind of an outsized influence over how parking is managed. And we want to kind of dissuade people from thinking that the public right of way is part of their personal property. So of course you want to, achieve broader goals of preserving the character of certain neighborhoods, like your great residential neighborhoods, but you also want to make sure that there aren't individuals who benefit more than other people in your community due to your parking management program.
Great. Here is a second question. Thank you, Vanessa, for that. Or I'm sorry, thank you, Catherine, for that question. Here is a second question from Eric. What are the best methods to gather data on curb use and management?
Well, we're going to talk about some of those data collection methods. We still do a lot of manual data collection. We go out with clipboards, inventory curb assets, and map parking spaces, map what's at the regulations at the curb, and then we collect a lot of demand data, occupancy data, turnover of parking space data. And now I'll talk about it in a little bit. Through our curb management research project, we're collecting data on TNC pickup and drop off, bike use, commercial delivery, to really look at dwell times that those vehicles are sitting at the curb, either waiting for passengers or loading and unloading. I mean, a lot of that still is a manual collection because it's challenging and can be expensive to install cameras or sensors to collect continuous data. But we are testing, which I'll talk about a little bit later, a lot of those camera-based, sensor-based technology solutions to figure out the challenges and what works, and think more broadly about technology to collect data on a larger scale. And a lot of you, if you are charging for parking, you have parking data that you can analyze regularly as well. A lot of cities we work with, we are able to collect either their garage data or on-street parking data, and then you can use that as a proxy for, if you have an area where there's a lot of parking hotspots, you can use that as a proxy for where people are going to be want to be dropped off from Uber and Lyft, or want to park their bike, or have a transit stop. So you can use some of your parking data as a proxy for other use data.
Great. One more question from Robin. Have Public Works begun considering the financial benefits of curb management in helping strapped city budgets?
Yes, and we're going to get into that. You know, that's one of the things we're stressing is there are a lot of private entities, private companies that want access to the curb. There are parking revenue declines right now. You know, some cities are seeing 90%, upwards of 90% declines in their parking revenues. And those revenues back up bonded debt, they go to the general fund. So, you know, we want to think about diversifying our revenue sources and really consider charging for all users of the curb, you know, not just parking. Okay, so after you've defined your curb priorities, we want to talk about implementation, selecting curb treatments. You know, also note that curb management is about selecting and testing these treatments. You know, what works today may not work, you know, in a few years, depending on new mobility, new technology that is available. So first, in selecting your curb treatments, there's a whole host of curb treatments available, from parking to pickup and drop off to bus lanes, commercial loading zones. And I want to walk through some case studies and learnings from some of these treatments. So first up, Boston, they piloted a passenger pickup drop off zone for Uber and Lyft. The city moved 4 parking spots to ride at pickup and drop off zones after 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. So overnight, evenings and overnights. And what they did was they geofenced the area. They geofenced the, not just the 4 parking spots, but the blocks surrounding those 4 parking spots that they moved to the pickup and drop off zone. So if you're calling an Uber or Lyft and you were within that geofenced area, you were directed in the app to go to this very specific location to be picked up. And Boston had to work with Uber and Lyft to geofence those areas. So drivers were permitted to stay in the spot for 5 minutes to wait for passengers. And for the first 10 or so, 2 weeks of the pilot, the city used parking officers to enforce the zones. And what they found was on one block, the number of vehicles that accessed the spaces increased from 3 parked cars per hour to 14 ride apps per hour. So that's a huge increase in the number of people that gained access to the space, but also they were preventing double parking and improving traffic flow. So that's, you know, the other benefit of these pickup and drop off spaces. But what they learned was, when you create any pickup and drop off space, you need to be very specific in your wayfinding. Even in the app, like I said, passengers were directed to the ride app zone, but it would even be better if you said, you know, go to Joe's Coffee and your driver will be there. It has to be very specific so that riders know where to meet their driver. And also allow enough space for vehicles to fully pull in. So that's larger than a typical parking stall. You don't, you know, a parking stall at 22 feet for the driver to pull in. Sometimes what Boston called the lazy driver, they didn't pull in all the way at the curb, so they were still kind of hanging out in the travel lane. So have a space that's larger than 22 feet so that the driver can pull in fully, and then you're not causing any congestion in the travel lane. And then the last thing is offsetting that parking meter revenue, like we were just talking about. Boston is getting about $30 a day from these spaces. So you have to make up for that lost parking revenue. Plus there's a lot of administrative work involved. So consider pricing ride-up fees or curb fees to make up for that cost. Now, there are a lot of great examples for Parklets. I think one great example is Spokane has a terrific program. We recently talked with the planners in Spokane about their program, which is a 2-tiered program. One, they allow public parklets for the public to enjoy, and then they have streeteries where specific businesses can repurpose on-street spaces for outdoor dining. This is an example here of a program we're working on in Benicia, California. We had recommended parklets as part of a downtown parking study, and it's taking a while to go through the process to implement the parklets, but once COVID happened, the city had to act really quickly, and we're now, we did a pilot period, and now we're implementing the parklet program. So that's, we're creating the design guidelines, permitting, drafting the code language necessary. And I would note that on parklets, some challenges with implementation can happen, especially if there's a very high slope of the street. And that's what we're dealing with in Benicia, that the street has a very high slope. So we're figuring out how do we use ramps on the parklets if we can't get them flush with the curb, so that we can accommodate ADA. And then just dealing with debris backup, making sure there's no flooding issues. When I was in Chicago, I did a study of the Chicago People Spot program, which is their parklet program. And we found that parklets increased the adjacent business receipts by 30% once they were installed. So it was a really successful program in Chicago, and I think we're seeing now that we can really repurpose these spaces to be more beneficial and provide more economic benefit to the community. And I'm happy to share that information for anyone that wants more info on parklets. And loading zones, Columbus, Ohio recently piloted a reserve loading zone program where they worked with the company called CurbFlow. CurbFlow is an app-based loading zone company, and what CurbFlow does is and what Columbus did was they entered into agreements with delivery companies. So drivers of the delivery companies like UPS, FedEx, others could reserve loading zone spaces within that CurbFlow app. And then they would reserve the space, if they had it for Friday at 10 p.m., they knew that space was available, they'd enter it, load, unload, and be on their way. Columbus was trying to really decrease the amount of double parking for delivery drivers. And what they found was that as a result of this reservation system, it did decrease because drivers had this reserved space. They didn't have to hang out in the travel lane. They weren't double parking. But a few important lessons that they learned was, one, the smartphone app it can be a challenge to implementation because, you have to expect the drivers to download the app, check in, check out, and they found the drivers really didn't want to do that. And so if they're not downloading the app and reserving and checking in the spaces, there's really no way to manage that, those reserved spaces, or enforce the reservation system, or eventually charge a fee. You would have to have people standing at all these loading zone spaces to enforce them. And, that's pretty unrealistic for almost any city. So it was an important learning that maybe anything that we do at the curb has to be easy and seamless. Drivers just want to get in and out, no matter what commercial drivers, ride app drivers. So apps might not be the right solution for all of these strategies. And then another learning on this curve from this Columbus pilot was charging fees for delivery companies, for FedEx and UPS. That might work. Charging them for this reservation of the space might work because a lot of these companies, well, probably most of them, they are already paying citations from double parking. Those payments and the citations they get, that can change year to year. It's an unpredictable expense on their part. So having these reservation-based fees might be more favorable to the delivery companies because it's a more predictable cost. But on the city side, these deliveries are short stays. So, thinking about transaction charges that the city has to pay for when it's charging fees, you have to think about what is the right fee structure so that transaction charge isn't more than the fee. So that's where maybe a permit-based system based on a size of the fleet might be a better option to start with. And then, we're talking a lot about non-parking users, but parking policies are curb management policies, time limits, pricing. So you really need to integrate parking management with your curb priorities. And one way is through performance pricing. And an example that can be adapted is San Francisco's SF Park program. In 2010, SF Park began, San Francisco got a $25 million grant from the federal government to pilot this performance-based pricing and base parking rates on real-time data. And the city periodically adjusted meter rates to maintain an average occupancy of parking spaces, and they use real-time sensors technology. Now, SF Park is a sophisticated solution, and it is unlikely to be replicated in most cities. It's expensive. There's a lot of administrative complexity that goes into that program. But I think there's a lot of learnings that other cities can apply when they think about an approach to performance pricing. And the learnings come from San Francisco, how they changed their approach to SF Park, because once the sensors reached the end of their useful life and were shut off, they were no longer getting that demand data. They didn't install new sensors. San Francisco is just using their meter revenue, and they use that meter revenue to adjust rates quarterly based on demand. And I think that's a learning that other cities can use is, go out and look at your hotspots, look at your demand data, and then you can use that data to understand your utilization and adjust your rates accordingly. Maybe you change them twice a year. You're not changing them quarterly or all the time. But you can increase them 25 cents every 6 months, or even decrease them 25 cents or 50 cents depending on demand, so that you can use that data to implement performance pricing. San Francisco's parking regulations also grant flexibility to change rates based on demand. So if you set those performance rates within your parking regulations, you don't have to go back to council every time you want a change. The regulations are based on performance pricing. So the language is, we would set rates based on an 85% occupancy target, or whatever your occupancy target is. So then you have that flexibility to change rates on your own without going through the arduous process through city council every time you want to change the rate. And then another important consideration for curb management is to coordinate your on and off street parking policies. Get these slides going here. Started working. So these are some models that we've, well, first off, if you may have underutilized parking garages, and they might be a good space for your pickup and drop off. Then maybe you can use your curb space at the most valuable space for more people-centered activities, for pedestrians, for bike parking, for parklets, and move some of your pickup drop-offs to underutilized parking assets. Or if you're a university and you have a lot of parking facilities, you can use those facilities for pickup and drop-off. So at Walker, we've modeled how passenger pickup and drop-off can work in off-street facilities. Our colleague Mary Smith did this modeling, and these models on the screen, which I don't know why they're not moving. Let's see if they can move. Here we go. So these models show the productivity of different designs for passenger pickup and drop-off. We know, based on our modeling, we can look at these different designs: a single stack file, a parallel design, a pull-through design, and we can know how many turnovers we can get per stall per hour. And this design is based on a model, but we also went out and collected data. We went out with stopwatches to collect Uber and Lyft data, and dwell time data and peak demand data, and we use that data to inform this modeling. But now we can use this modeling and tailor it to pick up and drop off in off-street facilities. So we can localize these models. This is a parking facility that had some underutilized spaces. They wanted to move those spaces to pick up and drop off. So we analyzed their peak demand for Uber and Lyft and other ride apps. We figured out what the necessary throughput was, and of course constraints on the space, getting around podiums and columns and other things. And then we use the modeling to say, okay, we think a pull-through design is going to be the best option here because it's the safest, it can get the most cars through per hour, and it's going to be adequate to keep your congestion flowing. So I'll stop there real quick and see if there's any questions.
A great time to weigh in with any questions. Let me just make sure I'm not missing any. No new ones.
Okay. So lastly, let's talk about some considerations as you're planning for curb management, implementation. We want to talk about data, technology, fees, and then some, Becky, is there a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Can you discuss data collection methods more? And then a couple more are coming in as well.
I'm not sure specifically what, I guess the data collection methods, maybe other than manual data collection. For curb use, what we're doing right now is we have a research study that we're going out and collecting data on all the different curb uses. So we're collecting the data in a few different methods, a few different ways. First, we are inventorying, we're looking at a street segment and figuring out what exists there. Is it mostly parking spaces? Is it mostly, are there any commercial loading spaces? And then we're mapping various street segments of what's out there, based on that inventory. And we're doing some manual collection where we are, just like a parking study. We're standing there, we're seeing who's using that right of way and that curb over the course of a day. If a Uber or Lyft pulls in, how many Uber or Lyft pull in at, what times, when are the peaks, how long are they dwelling? So, how long does it take for them to drop off a passenger or pick up a passenger? If there's a commercial loading, how long do they take to load? So we're doing some of that manually, but we're also setting up cameras and testing some of this technology to collect data. Where we're working with a city to install some cameras right now that will collect continuous real-time data. We're seeing some challenges with that because, getting the right angle, if you set up a camera, getting that angle is so important, and there are trees to consider, and, the tree coverage, or, if you use a wide lens camera, you might not get the right angle. So there's a lot of challenges that come with camera-based systems that you need to just consider and think about how to overcome them. But those camera-based systems can really provide ongoing data over, a 24-hour period. So that can be helpful if, you can't have people out manning the curb for all day and night to collect that data.
I'm sure you've never done that, Chrissy, in your career.
I have done that. But, I mean, and thinking about installing cameras, you could also, we're also testing just installing cameras in storefronts, in a vehicle across the street, getting, so you don't have to install the camera on a light pole and go to this very technical solution. You can also install a camera that you can find online for a couple $100. Like if you can get it, make sure that you can get great light at night and good, and it has even a battery backup, so you have continuous power, and you can install it in a storefront and get it, and then watch the footage. So you don't have to stand outside, all day and night.
Here's another question for you. Is there a formula for how much the pickup, drop-off activity offsets or reduces number of regular/permanent spaces that are needed in a parking lot?
I don't know that there's a number. I think it's based on demand. So that example I showed, go back to it, for the this design, we knew we needed to accommodate a specific number of vehicles during the peak hour. And no, it wasn't just the peak hour, it's really the peak of the peak hour, because these write-ups aren't coming in evenly across the hour. So we got down to what is the 15-minute increment where we're going to have the most vehicles. And we were able to use our modeling, and we know that this design for pull through, and each space can turn over, say, 25 vehicles per hour with an average dwell time of a few minutes. We can think about how long a vehicle is going to sit in that space, how many vehicles we need to accommodate, and then design around those conditions. But I don't think there's no one set formula. You really, even though those models are great, you really have to, base them on your local context.
It's really dependent on the land use too. Like we've seen a lot of disruption in parking demand for retail and restaurant uses and hotel uses due to increased Uber and Lyft activity. But for other land uses, the disruption to parking demand has been more minimal.
Here's another question. How does the stacked parking lot work? Do cars have to wait for other cars to leave?
So we just went through this. I'll show this design here. The stacked is probably the least productive. You can see that yes, you have to wait for other cars to leave, and it's not productive. We really wouldn't recommend this unless your adjacent land uses are so minimal that you don't need a lot of space for pickup and drop off. If you basically, even if you're doing a stacked, if you have a adjacent travel lane, you just want to have room for the vehicles to pull around, because it can result in backups. You can see they're moving up here in this upper left hand corner. They're moving through, but you'll see, I think it's this red car, he kind of gets stuck, and then the other cars behind him have to wait. But it like Mallory's saying, it depends on your adjacent land uses and your demand. This could be adequate enough for some communities if there's not a lot of demand right now. And even implementing a stacked design could be great to start out with. And then you can implement that, maybe even do something temporary, pilot it and see what the demand is, and then figure out how to adapt any changes necessary based on growing demand or decreased demand.
Great. Here's a follow-up to the data collection. Specifically, once you have the data, are you examples of how you do it, pen and paper or some kind of program? Not sure if that means like once it's collected, what do you do with it, or as you're collecting it? But that was the follow-up on the data collection. Can you give some examples of how you do it?
So what we're doing is, if we are going out and collecting it manually, we then have to input all that data, pen and paper, inputting that into a system, some kind of a data input system, probably Excel, and so that's pretty manual based. But a lot of these other if you put either installing a camera or putting the camera in the storefront, we've done a lot of research and met with companies that can read the camera footage either instantly, or you send them the footage and they can read it, and then they spit out a dashboard that's similar to like a Smarking or a T2 system, where you can see that information on a dashboard that shows you peak hour, average dwell time, who's using it. So it's just dependent on what type of data collection method you use.
Great. And one more question. Jessica wants to know, how much area could one person cover during manual curb use data collection?
So I think we would recommend having a few people out. We met with the city yesterday. We're talking about going out and collecting data, and I think we would need, at least 2 people per block, depending on the activities and the demands. You need someone to figure out, count who's using the curb, have your stopwatch there to be counting the dwell time. So if you are doing manual collections, at least 2 people per block or per hotspot, so that they can adequately collect the data you need. And because you don't want to be off by like minutes or on the dwell times, because then the information isn't correct.
Those are all the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so lastly, before we start our activity, just talking about data, like we were saying, you need data on what's out there, where your parking spots are, your loading zones, your curb cuts. You need data on who's using the curbs, and cities are mapping their curbs, and there's a lot of companies and other entities that are creating common data standards for curb inventory, similar to what we have with the GTFS system for transit. There are also private entities that have technology to inventory and map the curb, like Cord, or show you scooter or transit use data like Populous or Remix. So there, you can look into these companies, and we have now a lot of research on these companies to figure out what is best for you if you want to go that route. But the data it's just so critical and necessary. You need to see the whole picture of what's going on, what your curb looks like, who's using them. There are gaps in data, and this is why we have to do this manual collection, because while cities require scooter data from operators, or you can get transit data for boardings, there isn't good data on Uber or Lyft or ride apps. There isn't good data on commercial delivery. So that's why we have to go out and collect it ourselves right now. And speaking of the technology, curb management is just such a hot topic. There are a lot of companies that are building technology platforms to help you inventory and manage the curb and view this data. But these companies exist on a spectrum. Some just inventory curbs, and then others are they're creating these solutions to monitor license plates or vehicle decals, so they can analyze who's using the curb and then how to enforce it, how to collect access fees. There are companies also, like we talked about, that you can install cameras to get that real-time activity. Some companies are installing those cameras in storefronts and then sending that the parking space availability data to delivery companies, so they can direct those delivery drivers to open spaces for parking and delivery. So you would install a camera in a restaurant that looks at the parking space in front of that restaurant, and then they send that data to a DoorDash, so the DoorDash app says go here and park here. All of this technology is being tested. It's especially around the technology to support curb monetization. And I mentioned our research study. We've been testing this technology, and I mentioned some of the hurdles. For example, we found that the tree coverage really is a challenge around camera-based solutions. We are not going to cut down a tree, so we're trying to figure out ways to get around the tree coverage issue by putting cameras on a trailer. We installed, for example, a camera, and it had a wide angle, so a wide lens. So when we sent it to a company to review the footage, they couldn't really do it because their system can't look at a wide angle. So what we're doing now is thinking about, if we can purchase a trailer and put a camera on that trailer and set it up in a spot for a few weeks, collect a lot of data, you can get it positioned correctly, and then move that trailer throughout the city. That's an easier solution maybe than even installing a camera on a traffic signal or lamp pole. And you can test out a few different areas. So we're working now, meeting with a lot of we've met with pretty much all of the companies on this slide and others to study their solutions and to test some of them. But as you know, we talked about the curb management journey, and this technology, it's a major investment and it's complicated. It's not going to be a fit for every city right now, but there are companies on this slide that offer solutions to help you with the basics, with mapping and inventorying. And I just say one consideration when working with these companies is you want the data to be open and integrated with your other data. You don't want to wall off your data. And then, talking about fees, many of the private companies we're talking about today, Uber, Lyft, scooters, commercial delivery, they all rely on your curbs to be successful. They need those spaces for pickup and delivery. In the private companies, they're not maintaining the curbs. They are relying on cities to maintain those curbs. So I would, we encourage you to look at curb access fees, especially with travel options that are trending away from parking and your potential parking revenue losses. The curb access fees can help diversify your revenue sources and even over the long term create some revenue to generate funding for investments in things like bike parking that can improve access. But there are a lot of regulatory hurdles to implementing fees. For example, some states require voter approval, and collecting fees can be challenging. We've talked about geofences and reservation-based systems and the difficulties there, and it requires policy change and agreement. So curb monetization, it's really about an incremental process. We can start out with a per ride fee for ride apps, and then over time move that to a congestion-based ride app fee based on location. Or we can talk about a permit fee for delivery fleets based on their fleet size, and then eventually move to a reservation-based system. Some examples of fees: San Francisco just passed a ride-up fee, but in California that requires a ballot measure, which was successful. Chicago does have a tiered ride-up fee, which people pay a higher fee if they have a single ride. If they're a shared ride, they pay a lower fee, so that helps decrease congestion. And then we've also worked on scooter fees. We worked with the Columbia, Missouri and the University of Missouri on their dockless scooter RFP and regulations and their fee structures. And they use the RFP to select an operator to really get control over their scooters, but also to implement fees that they can use to help fund the administrative costs of scooter programs and the enforcement, and then fund some infrastructure investments. And then lastly, we'll talk about just some policy considerations as we're moving along on our curb management journey. First, just allowing flexibility in regulations. Regulations, like we talked about with performance pricing, allowing regulations that permit curb uses changes based on that curb prioritization framework Mallory talked about. So, you would allow, your regulations would say, you can implement, different uses or, different regulations along the curb based on the framework. So, that may change based on the community or the adjacent land use context. And if you have that framework in your regulations, you don't, and with, that's not as specific, but based on priorities, you don't have to go back to city council every time you want to test an idea, like moving a parking to a pickup and drop off space, or, implementing a fee. Second is just be aware of legislative efforts that could limit local control around data sharing and fees. Some of the places, especially airports or other entities we work with, their state legislatures have limited how they can charge fees, so they're not able to. And if there are, if legislation does pass that limits data, that's will severely limits cities' ability to plan for the curve. So, for example, in California, last year, AB 1112, which did pass the Assembly but died in the Senate, would have limited data sharing for scooter companies. So it's important to just be aware of legislation that's out there because it directly impacts your ability to plan to educate your elected officials on the pros and cons of that legislation. And then third, companies are consolidating, and that can limit options. When 5 scooter companies become 2, that could limit the city's leverage around things around data requirements or equity requirements. So that's another thing to be aware of. And then lastly, I just wanted to bring up partnerships and the concept of potential long-term privatization of the curb based on some of the trends we're seeing. We've talked about companies that have developed technology to inventory curbs, and that's great. And to monetize curbs eventually, that is bringing a lot of innovation to cities, access to capital. But one thing that can happen is, these companies can enter into agreements with other companies that need curb access, and they don't really need to involve the city into those agreements. Like we said, they can install cameras in storefronts to track those parking spaces and send that data over to Uber Eats and provide data on the space availability, which is great in concept because it should limit double parking and congestion. But it's important that the cities know that these partnerships exist and understand any effects on how they would impact city planning efforts. So, for example, maybe a business or a delivery company now is used to that space being available, and they expect that space to be available for their driver. So now if you want to put a bike lane in or start charging a fee, that could be a challenge. And then also just evaluate the long-term considerations of any agreements you make with private entities. And I think one thing to look at is learnings from public-private partnerships for parking assets. Points around long-term control of data and property. When Chicago privatized its parking meters, it gave away the rights to its curbs. And I worked on the renegotiation with the city to try and gain back some of those rights. But I can tell you, every time we looked at a bus lane or a bike lane, we had to we had to analyze the privatization because there was a financial impact. But then Chicago learned from that. And when the city was in a position to privatize Midway Airport, I staffed a city-led effort that we took 9 months to analyze all the deal and around core principles for the community and for residents and taxpayers, so that any partnerships with private entities or privatizations would ensure that the public was protected. So just, there's some learnings there from public-private partnerships that we may eventually be able to use for our curbs. And then lastly, I mentioned we have our curb management research project. We have some dedicated resources to use for this project. I'd be happy to talk with any of you if you want to reach out. We're working with cities to solve their specific curb management challenges through data collection, through testing technology, and from there we're going to create some curb management modeling. So with that, I think we want to jump to the group activity.
Chrissy, I have 2 questions for you real quick. One, what are some standard scooter or bike share fees and or profit sharing examples? Or are there some resources that you would recommend?
I think standard fees, I think it's on our website. We just did a sort of an analysis of a range of fees. There's usually either like an upfront permit fee that can range from $1,000. Some cities charge $10,000 for the permit fee. Like in Columbia, we did a per vehicle fee where the scooter company pays, it was a few dollars per vehicle per day, and gives that money directly to the city. Portland has a per vehicle fee plus a per ride fee of 25 cents. So I think it can range. I think it's important to understand all of the costs that will go in, the administrative costs that you're going to incur, and arrange your fee structure around recouping those administrative costs.
Great. And then another question, this came from Robin. What kind of policy framework is in place to protect the public and privacy when sharing data with private companies?
Well, that's important. It's important that cities have standards for their policy framework and data protection. I mean, there are regulations out there, but in the cities where, you know, in the research that we've done, you know, use agreements that require that you delete, that these companies delete data at a certain point, or, you know, they can't share data with third parties. You know, those are all important considerations that, and when cities enter into these agreements, that, you know, they're not, they're aware of, and they have that in a contract.
Great. And then one more question. Parking managers are often concerned about revenue implications of repurposing parking or metered parking for other uses. Have you conducted revenue analyses to estimate the impact of converting metered parking to different uses? If so, what methods do you recommend?
Yes, we have. We recently did a financial analysis for a city where we looked at all their parking data, historical and future forecasts, and we looked at implementing ride-up fees, commercial delivery fees, and weighed the trade-offs. So, you know, we just, you know, basically analyzed a range of ride-up and commercial delivery fees, looked at how many spaces we would need to convert, analyzed the lost parking revenue, and figured out, you know, what do the write-up and commercial delivery fees need to be to cover that lost parking revenue and to cover the administrative costs. And in this city, they're using parking and some of these fees to provide upgrades for bike parking or scooter parking and things like that. So, you know, it's really about a financial analysis to determine how many spaces you're losing, how much that parking revenue will be lost, and then what you need to recoup from the other user fees.
I would also just add that it's another opportunity to see whether you're getting the value that you need to out of your existing and sustained metered parking spaces. You know, a lot of cities don't raise rates for many, many years and decades even. And sometimes, even though you're eliminating certain metered parking spaces, you have the opportunity to do a rate study and determine whether you should be charging higher rates for your existing parking. And I know Chrissy has also analyzed whether, you know, a lot of communities don't charge on Sundays. And that's a great opportunity to see whether there's an opportunity to charge during extended hours or just charge more for the metered parking spaces you do have, in addition to looking at other revenue sources.
Such a good point. We so undervalue our curbs, and there, I mean, we understand there's so many political and community pushback and reasons for that. It can be challenging to get adequate pricing through.
Yeah, and I know we talked a lot about data collection, and I would just say that your community collaboration and your community outreach process should be seen as part of your data collection process. You know, so frequently community collaboration and public engagement is just seen as, you know, we met with X number of people and we had Y number of meetings, but there's not that clear line between what the public told you and what the outcomes were. And I think that it's not just a feedback opportunity, but it's also an opportunity to educate the public on the value of this space and show and demonstrate the value that it brings to the community. And that's where you can start to prime them for potential rate increases, if that's a direction you're going. If you have a community that's well versed in the value of this area, it will be a lot easier to implement moving forward.
Thank you, Mallory. Thank you, Chrissy. So we had planned a group activity, but it would take a little more time than we have left. So we're going to shift straight to a Q&A portion. So go ahead and throw any questions you have into the question box or the chat, and we'll just wrap up with Q&A. Thank you to Mallory and Chrissy for presenting. It was very, very compelling to me. Let's see if we get some questions in.
They're completely out of questions, Becky.
I think so. Okay, here we go. From Jonathan, how can cities leverage or piggyback off of adjacent procurements or programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you're starting to look at, existing procurement or existing programs, maybe depending on how far along you are in the process, maybe you can take a look at what you really need and even issue an RFI or expand your RFP to include like some of the more curb management activities with parking procurement or other programs.
Great, here's a question from Maureen. Any suggestions on how to enforce loading, unloading parking so it doesn't become longer term?
And well, I would say enforce it. I'm sure, Mallory and I are challenged with this all the time, where we work with cities who, where, there's not a lot of enforcement, or maybe maybe you have a parking ambassador, but there's a hesitance to issue the citation. So, actually going, dedicating resources to enforcement and issuing maybe warnings for the first few times in the citations. It's just part of the program, because you could have all the great plans and policies, but if you're not enforcing it, then that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, I would add that I think one of the main challenges is that if you have like a 15-minute loading zone, obviously you can't delegate an enforcement officer to circle back and forth in front of that loading zone every 15 minutes. That would be an incredible, waste of a labor force. So I think, as Chrissy mentioned, we see a lot of impacts from graduated fines and graduated enforcement. So making sure that you get scofflaws, and you also have this reputation, you build this reputation from your enforcement officers as being not overly strict or not ambassadors of the parking system, but simply, enforcing the laws that you have or the policies that you have on the book. So including those loading zones in their standard enforcement routes and doing graduated fines, starting with a warning and then moving up from there. We tend to see among enforcement violations, the same people violating over and over and over again. So that's where graduated fines are really helpful. But yeah, it's not easy, and it takes a lot of labor. But we also, a lot of our cities have had a lot of success with using license plate recognition and digital methods for enforcement rather than the traditional tire chalking. Wow. Tire chalking.
Tired talking? How much do you see curb design and retrofit? Oh, I popped up. How much do you see curb design and retrofit of existing curbs for influencing changes in driving and parking behavior? Or are these strategies always going to be reactionary to demand?
Well, that's where you look at your priorities and design your right-of-way and your curbs based on those priorities. So Mallory and I are working with the city right now where we're saying, these are the priorities that you've outlined in your transportation plan, in your parking program, in your climate plans. So what do our curbs need to look like to advance those goals? Do we need more access do we need more bus stops? Do we need bike lanes? Do we need bike parking? I would say the city should be proactive and force the change they want to see, not be reactive to, Bird or another scooter company drops a bunch of scooters, or, Uber, there's lots of Ubers. You have the power over your curbs, so leverage that. You can put up regulations, you can charge fees, you can be proactive for that space.
Absolutely. And I think if every curb management policy were just built on sheer demand, there would be massive swaths of on-street parking everywhere. And the vast majority of communities we work with have broader sustainability and even transportation demand management goals that they want to achieve, especially in their core downtown. So of course you have to create the curb that you want to not necessarily manipulate behavior. You know, it's not a Machiavellian pursuit, but direct people to and encourage them to use other travel choices. And I think that example that I brought up with Denver, moving their bike lane to the exterior of the right of way. So they had this on-street parking against the curb, which is the common framework. You know, everyone is used to pulling up to the curb to park, and the bike lane adjacent. And they had some huge safety concerns with bikers getting hit by folks speeding in the travel way. So they wanted to add that extra layer of protection. And so the city was very proactive in moving the bike lane, and they started again with a flex treatment. So they had temporary bollards and they had some temporary signage, and people were, annoyed, frustrated, confused at first, but they eventually all, adhered to that change. And now that bike lane is much, much safer. It's now a protected bike lane, and they aren't having the accident rate that they were before. So that's a great example of a city kind of taking that into its own hands and kind of ignoring the typical behaviors of constituents.
And that's such a good point.
Last question. I'm sorry, Christy. We have
I wanted to say it's great to just test the policies that you test them out, test out the treatments, see what works. I mean, you can do a temporary bike lane and just put up some temporary bollards and see who uses it. I think it's a great way to test and adapt and let people see what this looks like and experience it, so then what to make permanent.
One last question. Many advocates are trying to remove enforcement from transportation solutions. What enforcement light strategies do you see out there that can help eliminate racial bias?
So yeah, we've definitely have been figuring out what are the best enforcement tools that we have at our disposal, so that we're not basing enforcement along racial lines. And that's where, if you have, I just worked with a community where we recommended a parking ambassador program, where it's not a punitive, you're not issuing punitive citations, you're issuing warnings, or it's not, and your enforcement isn't coming out of a sheriff's office or a police department. It's a community ambassador who wears a uniform, and lots of cities have implemented community ambassador programs where people walk around and provide directions, or talk to people at the bus stop. And if there is a vehicle that's overparked, give it a warning for the first 1, 2, 3 citations, and then if they are taking advantage, then you can start actually issuing a paid citation.
Yeah, and if I could add, you want to start from a preventive perspective. We don't create rules so that people will break them, and we don't create rules to generate revenue for the city. We create rules to create a better mobility system for everyone in the community. So starting with the planning process, make sure that everyone in your community is involved in that process. Make sure that you're reaching those underrepresented groups, which tend to include people of color for many, many communities, and create options for them. I think of like truancy on the same line as parking enforcement. A lot of the time, it's just people don't have other options. They don't know the rules and regulations, and they're in a situation where it's difficult for them to follow the rules. So start there and see what for example, long-term parking options you can create for people who are experiencing that, so that you don't get a reputation of penalizing people when they don't have any other options.
That about wraps it up. We're happy to stick around for any other questions, but we're over our official time. So thank you so much to Mallory and Chrissy for taking the time for this presentation. And most of all, thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it.
And this is Christine, your normal webcast moderator. I just want to remind everyone that this session has been recorded and it will be available up on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast, and we'll also have a PDF copy of this presentation available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, APA Colorado, Mallory, Chrissy, and Becky. Thank you. And everyone, we will talk next time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.